Monday, April 19th, 1993. At noon, the Mount Carmel Center is an inferno. Outside, the FBI watches, while inside, 76 people are taking their final breaths, and 25 of them are just kids. For the past 51 days, the world watched this standoff. The media called them brainwashed. The public called them crazy. But the roster of the dead tells a different story. A computer programmer, a professional nurse, and a lawyer from Harvard University. These were not the uneducated people you were told about. In fact, their intelligence made it easier to manipulate them. This scorching inferno was a collision of two mental traps. A narcissist who deconstructed the human ego, and a government agency suffering from a lethal case of group thinking. This is how a failed rock star built a psychological fortress, and why the FBI was doomed to burn it down.
That he would be a Messiah that would save the world.
Yes, we have guns.
So why did they have all the guns and bullets? They were preparing for the apocalypse.
Were not because he was paranoid, but rather because Satan was going to come for them.
Before he was David Koresh, the Messiah, he was Vernon Howell. He was a high school dropout from Houston with a learning disability and a guitar. In the early 1980s, Vernon moved to Los Angeles with a single, desperate goal. He wanted to be a rock star. But the Sunset Strip was a graveyard for mediocre talent. Vernon was rejected by every club and every record label he approached. This is where the story truly begins. Koresh had a high degree of narcissistic entitlement. When he faced an ego-shattering failure, he could not fade away. He had to compensate. If Vernon couldn't be a god on the stages of Hollywood, he would find a stage where he could be a god. In 1981, he arrived at the Mount Carmel Center in Waco, Texas. This was the home of the Branch Davidians, a religious splinter group that was looking for a prophet, and Vernon was looking for an audience. He didn't just join the group, he performed for them. He memorized the entire Bible. He used his learning strengths to weaponize scripture. He could cite obscure Bible verses for 15 hours straight without a script. To the Davidians, this was supernatural, not just impressive. By 1990, Vernon Howell had legally changed his name to David Koresh. David was for the biblical king. Koresh was for Cyrus the Great, the Persian king who liberated the Jews. He was no longer a failed musician. He created his new identity, a persona immune to the world's rejection. But a prophet is nothing without followers, and Koresh knew exactly how to hunt for them. He didn't go to the edge of society to find his recruits. He went to the people who thought they were too smart to be fooled. It's a common misconception that cults only attract the broken and the desperate. But Koresh didn't want the desperate, he wanted the devoted. He targeted the educated, engineers, nurses, and those who were highly intelligent. Psychologically, there's a reason for this. Intelligent people are often better at rationalization. Instead of leaving when Koresh's behavior did not make sense or was abnormal, they used their intellect to bridge the gap and explain it. And Koresh provided the materials for these bridges. He used a technique called love bombing. In the first few weeks at Mount Carmel, new recruits were showered with intense, focused attention. They felt like they were joining the only true family on earth, not just a church. After he created a strong emotional bond, Koresh stripped their identities. He claimed that as the final prophet of God, he was the only one permitted to have wives. He annulled every marriage in the compound. Husbands were forced into celibacy, while Koresh took their wives as his own. So why did they stay? It's because Koresh didn't ask for their wives on day one. First, he asked for their time, then their money, and eventually their sleep. By the time he asked for their families, they had already invested so much of their lives that leaving would mean admitting they had been conned. Admitting that was greater than the pain of the sacrifice itself. Koresh had successfully created a closed logic loop. Every doubt was labeled as Satan's influence. Every outside news report was Babylonian propaganda. He was building a fortress of the mind through groupthink. By 1992, the 130 people inside Mount Carmel were no longer individuals. They were a single psychological force. And outside the gates, another massive force was waking up. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms had heard rumors of illegal weapons at the Mount Carmel Center. and instead of planning a conversation, they were planning a raid. By early 1993, the ATF had built a massive case against Koresh. They suspected him of manufacturing illegal machine guns and grenades. They decided to execute a raid through overwhelming speed and surprise, but on the morning of February 28th, the surprise was already dead. A local news reporter had accidentally tipped off a mail carrier who happened to be a Davidian. The carrier rushed back to the compound and told Koresh. Inside Mount Carmel, 130 people were now arming themselves. Outside, the ATF commander was told that Koresh knew they were coming. This was the first critical moment. The ATF had spent months planning. They had 76 agents and cattle trailers ready to roll. To call it off now felt like a defeat they couldn't stomach. So they gave the order to move in anyway. At 9:45 a.m., the trailers pulled up to the front door. Within seconds, the quiet Texas morning turned into a war zone. No one knows for sure who fired the first shot, but the result was a 2.5-hour gunfight. Agents were crouched behind thin metal trailers as bullets punched through the walls. Davidians were firing from every window. 4 ATF agents were killed. 6 Davidians lay dead inside. By the time a ceasefire was brokered, the damage was already done. For the Davidians, this was proof everything Koresh had warned them about. God's enemies had come to kill them and their children. Their identity as the persecuted was now cemented in blood. On the government side, the tragedy created a moral debt. They had lost 4 of their own. They couldn't just walk away and let Koresh win. And as the sun set on February 28th, the ATF pulled back and the FBI moved in. They brought tanks, helicopters, and a siege mentality. The standoff had begun. When the FBI arrived at Waco, you would have expected they were a single, unified force. Instead, they were a house divided against itself. On one side was the negotiation team, led by Gary Nosner. Their philosophy was built on empathy, patience, and de-escalation. On the other side was the hostage rescue team, the tactical elite. Their philosophy was built on pressure, dominance, and a dynamic end to the crisis. For the next 51 days, these two groups would fight a quiet, internal war. Ultimately, it would seal the fate of everyone inside the compound. In the first few weeks, Nosner's team was winning. They stayed on the phone with Koresh for hours. They listened to his sermons and built a fragile bridge of trust, and it worked. Slowly, Koresh began letting go. 35 people walked out of those gates because of the negotiators' patience. But to the tactical commanders, this wasn't progress. It was Koresh acting like a common criminal, stalling and playing games. They believed that if you applied enough pressure, the smart people would surrender. But when a person feels their freedom is threatened, their natural response isn't to comply. It's to rebel even harder, to reclaim that sense of control. While the negotiators were trying to lower the temperature, the tactical team was turning it up. They surrounded the compound with floodlights that turned night into day. They blasted high-decibel sounds through massive speakers, like Tibetan chants and the sounds of rabbits being slaughtered. They even played Nancy Sinatra's "These Boots Are Made for Walking" for 24 hours. This was meant to deprive them of sleep and break their will. Instead, it became the FBI's greatest psychological failure. To the people inside, the loud music wasn't a reason to leave. It was a gift to David Koresh. He used the noise and the light as proof of the outer darkness he had prophesied. The FBI was no longer a law enforcement agency, they were Satan's minions at the door. Every tank that drove across the lawn didn't scare the Davidians into surrendering, it validated their belief that they were the chosen few. On the other side, the FBI suffered from their own version of groupthink. They had convinced themselves that total pressure was the only language Koresh understood. They thought the negotiators were weak or soft. Tactical commanders began making moves without even telling the negotiation team. The psychological chess match was over, and the tactical clock was ticking. And just as the calendar turned to April, the FBI was about to double down on a losing hand. By the middle of April, the standoff had entered its 7th week. The FBI was spending over $1 million every single day to maintain the perimeter. Thousands of law enforcement officers were stationed in the relentless Texas heat. Politically, there was pressure on the Attorney General to end the conflict. The FBI maintained their commitment because they had already done so much. They had invested too much time, money, and reputation to walk away. If they left now, the 4 dead ATF agents would have died for nothing. To the tactical commanders, a peaceful resolution was not a success. They needed an arrest. Inside the compound, David Koresh was trapped in the exact same loop. He had promised his followers they were the army of God fighting the final battle. He had already invested the lives of 6 Davidians. If he surrendered now, he was admitting his identity was a lie. The cost of being wrong was higher than the cost of dying. And on April 14th, Koresh offered a final deal. He said he would surrender as soon as he finished his 7 Seals manuscript. To the negotiators, this was the breakthrough they had prayed for. But to the tactical team, it was just another stalling tactic. They were suffering from groupthink so severe they no longer saw Koresh as a human being. They saw him as a monster who was playing them for fools. Then, they rationalized their plan for a massive gas attack as the humane way to force everyone out. They invested everything into their failing strategy, so they didn't change course. They doubled down. The FBI was about to stop talking, and the tanks were about to start moving. At 6 a.m. on April 19th, the FBI had enough. 2 massive tanks began moving towards the compound carrying CS gas. The FBI had tactical tunnel vision. They believed that if they made the air unbreathable, the Davidians would choose survival. But they ignored the clinical reality of how CS gas would affect the trapped but devoted group. CS gas causes the eyes to slam shut and the lungs to feel as if they are on fire. To a normal person, this triggers a flight response. But for the Davidians, they had nowhere to fly. They retreated into the bunker, a concrete room at the center of the building. They put wet blankets over their children's faces. They huddled together in the dark, gasping for air. The gas was confirmation sent from heaven. Koresh had told them the world would try to poison their spirits, and now the government was literally poisoning the air. For 6 hours, the tanks punched holes in the walls and pumped in 400 canisters of gas. The FBI waited for the Davidians to come out with their hands up, but they didn't. Instead, the group had reached their final lethal stage. The Davidians weren't thinking about the FBI. They were all watching David Koresh. He was still calm. He was still God's prophet. At 12:07 p.m., the first wisp of smoke appeared from a second-story window. Since the FBI had smashed massive holes in the building, the compound became a giant wind tunnel. When the fire started, the air rushed in and turned the structure into a blast furnace. Their humane plan had created a literal death box. The FBI watched through thermal imaging as the Davidians moved deeper into the flames. Only 9 people managed to escape the inferno. The other 76 stayed. They died waiting for a miracle that Koresh had promised would come. But the only thing that came was the fire. The fire at Mount Carmel consumed the building, the lives inside, and more importantly, reason. The Davidians died because their minds built a perfect, logical cage they couldn't escape. And the FBI didn't kill them because they were incompetent. They killed them because they were so invested in a tactical win, they lost sight of the human cost. This is Mind Your History, where we explore the mind behind the moment. Next time, we look at the mind of Osama bin Laden, not just the terrorist, but the obsessive pattern seeker. Subscribe to see how conspiracy culture reinforced the ideology of Al-Qaeda.